covering it up. He's lying about it. It's a devastating series of sins. It's dominoes falling one after the next. Now, how did this happen? David did not wake up one bright, beautiful Saturday morning and say to himself, "What a nice day. I think I'm going to commit adultery and murder my best friend." Of course he didn't. That's not how sin works, is it? This story works in small little steps, one leading to the next, to the next, to the next, until the very end. There's no way, if you would have been able to go back in time to 5 years before these events took place, or even 1 year, or even 1 week before these events took place, if you were to say, "David, do you think you'd ever commit adultery?" David would say, "Of course not. I love the law of God. I love the righteousness of God. I want to obey God." And yet here he is. So how does it work? How does it happen? Satan works in steps, little steps. It's David looking out his window one evening, and rather than looking away when he is tempted, he continues to look. And rather than leave that behind, he actually sends a messenger to the lady next door. And rather than leave it at that, David then has that woman come over. And rather than leave it at that, which was bad enough by this point, David then orchestrates a scheme, which we'll dig into in a moment or two, by which his best friend is killed in battle. One little domino leading to the next until they all fall over. By the end of the story, I count at least 5 of the 10 commandments broken: idolatry, adultery, murder, coveting, and bearing false witness. By my count, that's half the 10 commandments in one story. The man after God's own heart. Nowadays, we like to tell ourselves that people are basically good at heart. Right? You've heard that said. We're all pretty good we're all good human beings. People are basically good. It's the environment that's wrong. It's society that's a mess. My family was no good, but I'm a pretty good person. This story shows us that it just ain't so. We can't say about human nature that we're all pretty good people. Dorothy Sayers was an essayist. She wrote. She was a British writer back in around the time of the Second World War. Fabulous writer, very insightful, very witty. So her work is a lot of fun to read. She talks about the problem of evil in the world today. And one of the things that she says is that as Christians, we should never be surprised by the depravity and the evil that we see unfolding all around us. She goes on to say that atheists, or as she calls them, secularists, they always seem to be surprised. They always seem to think that it's unexpected when murders happen and school shootings and terrorism. Now, those are modern updating of what she was talking about. But she says atheists and secularists are always surprised by these kinds of things. But as Christians, we shouldn't be surprised. We should be heartbroken, to be sure, she says, but never surprised. Why? Because the Bible tells us that human nature is deeply flawed and deeply fallen. Do you want to understand what's wrong with the world today? Do you want to understand the motive behind racism and gun violence and terrorism and all these other such things that plague the headlines? We have a good description of that here. Human nature is deeply flawed. It's sinful. We need to have a big view of sin. Now, I know some of you are thinking, spoken like a true Calvinist, right? Calvinists always seem to want to talk about sin, but really, we need to understand the power and the prevalence of sin in our world today. We should never undermine it. We should never minimize it. It's incredibly dangerous. In fact, the biggest mistake that we would make looking at this story is to say, I would never do something like David did. I realize that's a shocking thing to say. But as I read this story, and that was my first reaction, by the way, but then I got to thinking, am I saying that I am better than David? Are we better than David? See, the very sins that lurked in David's mind, the very seeds lurk in our minds as well and in our hearts. The seeds of jealousy, covetousness, lust, anger, they may bear fruit in different ways in our life. But isn't it true that the seeds are in our hearts and minds as well? What does that mean for us? It means that when we recognize the seeds in our own heart and our own mind, we have to be vigilant to squash those seeds, to get rid of them. Peter says in the New Testament, watch out, be on your guard. Why? Because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for whom he might destroy. Satan works in small little increments, in small little gradations, one little step at a time. So when we see the first little hint of sin, we need to identify it and ask that God would remove that from our lives, that He would give us the strength to resist. Because if we don't, it will give birth to the kinds of sins that we see here. Maybe not these exact ones, but similar in scale. So as important as all that is, that's the foolishness of sin. But that's not really what the story is about. This story is not about so much about